Why were they treating her like a criminal? The thought burned through Lieutenant Sarah Kane's mind as the metallic snap of handcuffs cut through the courtroom's air. The sound was too familiar, too sharp, too much like the final click of a rifle's safety before a kill shot. Only this time, the target was her. Every camera turned, every whisper sharpened. She felt the stares of men and women who had never tasted war but loved to judge those who fought it. The Navy SEAL sniper, the woman with 34 confirmed kills, now sat restrained, like a threat to her own country. Her dress blues were immaculate, every fold a testament to discipline drilled into her bones. But her hands, the same hands that once steadied a rifle to save lives, now trembled slightly against cold steel. She controlled the tremor instantly. Old training. Never show weakness. The prosecutor's shoes clicked as he approached the bench, self-satisfied and rehearsed. "Your Honor," he began, voice oily and deliberate, "given the defendant's specialized training, we believe these restraints are necessary for everyone's safety." He said it with the smugness of a man who'd never been close enough to danger to understand it. Judge Wilcott leaned forward, an old man with medals gathering dust somewhere in an attic, a veteran of a war that time forgot. His eyes studied Sarah not as a woman, not even as an officer, but as a soldier caught in the gears of a system that devoured its own. "Lieutenant Kane," he said finally, voice deep and steady, "you understand these proceedings regard your alleged assault on a superior officer." Sarah lifted her gaze. Her voice came out flat, sand dry. "I do, Your Honor." It was all she said. The prosecutor smirked the way predators do when they think they've already won. Around them, murmurs filled the courtroom. Journalists scribbled. A few sailors in uniform shifted uncomfortably. No one looked her in the eyes for long. Because there was something about Sarah Kane that made people uneasy. She was too composed, too quiet, like a rifle trained on you from somewhere you couldn't see. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Then let's proceed." But he didn't get the chance. The double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with a sound like a cannon shot. "Admiral on deck." The command came from instinct. Half the sailors in the room shot to their feet before realizing where they were. The rest scrambled after them. Silence followed, thick and stunned. Four-star Admiral James Thorne stepped through the doorway. He didn't walk, he stormed. His dress whites gleamed under the courtroom lights, medals clinking like distant thunder. But it wasn't the medals or the uniform that silenced the room. It was his eyes. Cold, controlled, burning with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The prosecutor froze mid-step, color draining from his face. The judge's gavel hung midair. Thorne didn't even glance at them. He went straight for Sarah. His boots echoed against the floor, each step deliberate like a countdown. He stopped in front of her table, close enough that she caught the faint smell of salt and gun oil, the smell of the sea, of combat, of everything she missed. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He didn't ask permission. The handcuffs hit the floor. The sound of metal on tile echoed through the courtroom like artillery fire. Sarah's breath caught, though she didn't mean it to. The courtroom went still, the kind of silence you only heard before something irreversible happened. "Sir," she began, but Thorne silenced her with a look. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. "You handcuffed one of my sailors." The prosecutor tried to speak, but his throat clicked instead. Thorne stepped closer to him. "Do you have any idea what those hands have done for this country?" No one moved. And then the admiral began to tell the story. The courtroom faded into memory, replaced by the searing heat of Mosul, 2017. The rooftop reeked of cordite and blood. Sarah lay prone behind her rifle, cheek pressed against the stock, heartbeat sinking to her breath. "Command be advised," she whispered into her radio, voice low but steady. 20+ hostiles approaching the schoolhouse, Mixed weapons. Over. Static crackled. Abort Angel, no row clearance. Repeat, abort. She stared through the scope. Her reticle hovered over a convoy of trucks, armed men laughing, shouting. They had children corralled outside the building. One of the men yanked a girl out by her arms, small, terrified, no older than 8. Sarah's finger tightened unconsciously on the trigger. Angel, do not engage, the voice repeated. She didn't hear it anymore. Through her crosshairs, she saw the child's face, the exact same age as her little sister had been when she left home for Bud S. And then the decision made itself. The rifle cracked once. The man dropped before he even knew he'd been hit. Then another, and another. The world slowed into clarity, the rhythm of death she had learned to master. When the QRF finally reached the schoolhouse, 14 terrorists lay dead in the sand. The little girl was alive. Sarah never wrote about it, never told anyone. But Admiral Thorne knew. Let me tell you what those hands have done, counselor. Thorne's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. In Mosul, she took a shot against orders to save a school full of children. 14 hostiles dead, one little girl alive. That's what those hands have done. The prosecutor's mouth hung open. And that's just one mission, Thorne added quietly. The judge sat back, fingers pressed to his chin. Something unspoken flickered behind his eyes, maybe respect, maybe guilt. Thorne turned back to Sarah. For a moment the hard edges of his expression softened, just a little. The silence stretched until the prosecutor tried again, voice thin and shaking. Admiral, with respect, the charge still stands, the alleged assault. Thorne's gaze snapped to him. That superior officer she allegedly assaulted, he said, voice cold as steel, is Captain Richard Vaughn, who, as of 800 this morning, is under court-martial for sexually assaulting 3 female junior officers. Gasps erupted. Thorne slapped a file down on the prosecutor's table so hard it made him flinch, including Lieutenant Kane's sister. The room exploded, reporters shouted, cameras flashed, the judge's gavel slammed like thunder. Through it all, Sarah sat motionless. The only sign of life was the faint tightening of her jaw. She didn't look at anyone, not Thorne, not the prosecutor, not even the judge, because for the first time since she'd been arrested, she finally allowed herself to feel something other than control. Rage. Not the hot, loud kind, the cold, steady kind that burns slow and deep, the kind you can't show, only carry. Thorne turned toward her again. What he did next silenced the room entirely. He raised his hand in salute. A 4-star admiral saluting a lieutenant. Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat, then returned it, slow, deliberate, precise. The air felt electric. The judge's voice broke the silence, but softer now. Your court-martial is dismissed, Lieutenant Kane. The prosecutor opened his mouth to protest, but the judge's glare stopped him cold. Get out of my courtroom, Wilcott said. The man obeyed. When the doors shut behind him, Sarah exhaled for the first time in what felt like months. That night she couldn't sleep. The metal ribbon still itched against her uniform collar. The echoes of the courtroom still lived behind her eyes, Thorne's words, the reporter's murmurs, her own silence. Her sister had called, voice trembling, to thank her. But Sarah didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if she'd done the right thing anymore, or if she'd just done what was necessary. There's a difference. She walked out onto the pier behind the base, moonlight glinting off calm water. She spent half her life on missions no one would ever know about. The other half, she was trying to remember who she was before them. The Navy Cross would come later, the headlines, the ceremony, the applause. But none of it mattered here in the quiet. The sea didn't care about medals. She stared out at the horizon, hands still marked faintly from the cuffs. It was strange, she thought, how those same hands had once taken lives to save others, and yet in that courtroom they'd called her dangerous. Maybe they were right. Maybe you had to be dangerous to survive honorably in a world that punished courage. She looked down, whispered to the night not as a soldier, but as a woman who'd seen too much. Sometimes, she said softly, the hardest battle isn't the one out there. The waves didn't answer, but the silence did. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? Sarah stood alone on the pier, the hum of distant ships whispering across the black water. The courtroom victory should have felt like freedom, like vindication, but instead it felt like a bruise that refused to fade. The Navy Cross sat boxed in her quarters unopened. Reporters had called it a triumph of justice. Admirals called it a proud day for the SEALs. But Sarah knew the truth. It wasn't triumph. It was survival. The headlines had faded within a week. The story had been consumed, replaced, forgotten. Another strong female soldier, headline buried beneath the next political storm. But the ghosts didn't fade as easily. She leaned against the railing, eyes tracing the dark horizon. In her mind, the sea became a screen, replaying fragments of everything that had led to that courtroom. The mission in Yemen, the rescue in Raqqa, the mistakes that no one talked about. And Vaughn, the man who wore the same uniform she did, but none of its honor. The man she'd trusted once, before she'd seen what he was capable of. The moment she struck him still echoed in her bones. His hand had been on her shoulder, his breath too close. His words soft, poisonous. And when her fist met his jaw, it hadn't been out of rage. It had been instinct. He'd smiled through bloodied teeth. "You'll regret that, Lieutenant." He'd been right for a while. Sarah closed her eyes, the memory sharp as a sniper's reticle. 2 years earlier. Coronado, California. The air smelled like salt and sweat, Bud's training grounds. "Get up, Kane," the instructor's voice cracked through the dawn. "You think the enemy's gonna wait while you catch your breath." She pushed herself off the sand, chest heaving, uniform soaked, arms trembling under the weight of the log. Around her, 11 men, her team, stared in disbelief. The only woman in the class, and she wasn't quitting. She couldn't. Not after what she'd promised. Her sister's letter still lived in her breast pocket, the one written when Sarah first enlisted. "If you make it through, you'll show them we can belong anywhere." She'd folded that note so many times it was soft as cloth now. But Bud's didn't care about motivation. It only cared about breaking you. She'd watched men stronger than her drop out, cry, beg, walk away. But she stayed, because pain didn't scare her, failure did. One night during Hell Week, while the team dragged a raft across the freezing surf, someone whispered behind her, "You're just here to make headlines, Kane." She ignored it. Another voice joined, "You think they'll trust you in the field, you'll get someone killed." Still, she kept moving. By dawn, her shoulders were bleeding raw, her lips blue. But when the instructor walked down the line and asked who wanted to quit, she stayed standing. That was the day Admiral Thorne visited the compound. He didn't say much, just watched from a distance as she hauled the log with the men, but his expression lingered, quiet, unreadable. Later, someone told her he'd asked for her file personally. Back on the pier, Sarah smiled faintly at the memory. Thorne had believed in her before she even believed in herself. He'd been the one who approved her sniper program transfer, the one who sent her overseas when others wanted to sideline her. And now, the one who'd saved her in that courtroom. But even that truth felt heavy, because somewhere deep down she wondered, why did he show up that day? Admirals didn't walk into courtrooms for lieutenants, not without reason. She replayed the scene again in her mind. His entrance, the salute, the words he'd said to silence the prosecutor. It had felt like justice, yes, but also like a message. Someone higher up wanted this buried. And Thorne had made sure it was. She didn't know whether to thank him or question him. The sea breeze picked up, carrying the faint hum of helicopters from the nearby airstrip. She turned to leave and froze. A man in civilian clothes stood at the far end of the pier, half shadowed by a light pole, hands in pockets, watching her. When their eyes met, he nodded once, then he was gone. Sarah's pulse kicked. She walked toward where he'd stood, nothing, just empty pier. But on the railing, someone had left a folded piece of paper weighed down by a coin. Navy Challenge coin, SEAL team insignia, but not hers. She unfolded the paper. 4 words typed. They weren't all caught. Sleep didn't come that night. She sat at her desk in quarters, staring at the note. The coin caught the light, spinning slowly. The words itched under her skin. They weren't all caught. Vaughn was in custody. Thorne had said so himself, so who else? She turned on her laptop, opening the internal Navy directory. Her access was limited, but she still had friends, people who owed her favors. She typed in Vaughn's unit record. 3 other names popped up, officers who'd served under him during a joint operation in Bahrain. 2 were transferred, 1 was on leave. Except the leave record had no return date. She felt it immediately. That quiet instinct that used to hum in her veins before missions. The one that whispered when something didn't add up. Someone was covering something. And somehow it still involved her. Her inbox pinged a message from an encrypted sender. No subject, no signature. Just a single attachment, a photo. Vaughn. Not in uniform, not in a cell. Walking into a building in Arlington. Timestamp 3 days ago. Her breath stopped. The courtroom replayed in her head, Thorne slamming that file, saying, as of 800 this morning, he's awaiting court-martial. Had he known? Or had he lied? She closed the laptop and sat back, heartbeat steady but hard. If Vaughn was free, that meant everything she'd been through, the trial, the humiliation, the medal, was part of a bigger game. Someone had needed her silence. Someone had needed a story that made the Navy look good. And she'd given them one. A decorated sniper, a court cleared by justice, a medal ceremony, perfect headlines. But the truth was messier. She opened the drawer beside her bed. The small box with the Navy cross still waited there, unopened. She ran her thumb over it, then closed it again. Not tonight. There were battles you didn't fight with bullets. The next morning, she reported to base command as ordered. The corridors of the Naval Special Warfare Building were too bright, too clean, like nothing bad had ever happened inside them. Thorne was waiting in his office. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, motioning to the chair opposite his desk. She didn't sit. "Why did you do it?" He exhaled, eyes steady. "Do what?" "Come to that courtroom." He studied her for a long time before answering. "Because the Navy doesn't abandon its own." "Doesn't it?" she said softly. "Vaughn's free." His jaw tightened. "You have proof." She slid the printed photo across his desk. His eyes flicked to it, then back to her. No reaction, just that same unreadable calm. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Thorne leaned back, fingers steepled. "You don't understand how deep this goes, Lieutenant." "Then help me understand." Silence. Finally, he spoke. "There are men in this institution who think the uniform gives them immunity. Vaughn was one of them, but he's not the only one. There are careers, contracts, entire operations at risk if this gets out. The Navy can't afford another scandal. And you're okay with that?" His eyes met hers. "No, but I'm not naive enough to think justice always wins." Her voice cracked the first time in years. "So the medal was what? Hush money." Thorne didn't flinch. "It was protection. You're too visible now. They won't touch you." She stared at him, and the others. A pause, then quietly, "We'll get them, but not your way." She left the office without saluting. Outside, the wind whipped her hair into her face, but she didn't feel it. The world blurred, a mix of sunlight and betrayal. She'd spent her whole career believing in codes, in duty, in honor. Now those words tasted hollow. But she also knew something Thorne didn't. You can silence a soldier, but you can't unteach them how to fight. That night she opened the metal box. The Navy Cross gleamed inside, silver and clean. She turned it over. Engraved beneath her name were two words: for valor. She smiled bitterly. Then she pocketed the coin from the pier beside it. If the system wanted silence, it would have to earn it. Outside, the sea was black again, but this time it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a warning, because the girl who'd once obeyed every order had just remembered how to think for herself again. And somewhere in Arlington, a man named Vaughn was still breathing. What if the truth you fought for could destroy everything you loved? Sarah drove through the pre-dawn streets of Arlington with that question clawing at the edges of her mind. The Navy Cross sat on the passenger seat, glinting faintly under the dashboard lights, a symbol of honor that now felt like a bribe. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She didn't answer. She'd been awake all night, tracing the same trail. Vaughn's court-martial, the encrypted email, the coin, the photo. Every thread led to a wall, and every wall had Admiral Thorne's shadow behind it. She didn't want to believe it. She owed that man her freedom. But she also owed her conscience the truth. The base lights disappeared in her rearview mirror. The road opened into the city, wide, empty, silent. She'd been here before, years ago, when she still believed that the uniform meant something incorruptible. Now she wasn't sure what she believed. She parked in an underground garage 2 blocks from Navy HQ. From her glove compartment she pulled a small envelope. Inside, a flash drive. The one she'd been compiling quietly for weeks. Mission logs, declassified snippets, communications records. Nothing incriminating on its own, but together they told a story. A story the Navy didn't want told. 2 hours later, she walked into the Defense Records building, civilian clothes, hair tied back, credentials clipped to her pocket. The lobby was sterile, echoing with footsteps and muted conversations. She approached the security desk. Lieutenant Sarah Kane, retired, here to access archival logs under FOIA Request 402B. The guard scanned her ID, nodded, and buzzed her through. She filed the request weeks ago, back when she thought she was just trying to understand her case file. But now she wanted more. She wanted Vaughn. In the records room, she sat at a terminal and typed his name. CAPT Richard Vaughn. Files popped up, some open, some redacted. She clicked one marked Disciplinary Review Sealed. The screen flashed, Access Restricted, Clearance Level Omega. Omega clearance, highest level, only admirals and joint task heads. Her pulse quickened. Someone had buried it deep. She typed again, this time using a backdoor code a friend from Intel had once shown her. Risky, illegal, but effective. The file opened for 6 seconds before the system froze, but it was enough. A date, a location, a signature. Admiral James Thorne. Sarah's stomach dropped. The document was a transfer order, Vaughn reassigned, not imprisoned. His new role, Advisor, Naval Intelligence Task Force Aegis. So it was true. Thorne hadn't saved her from injustice. He'd redirected it. She left the building fast, pulse hammering, the air outside suddenly too thick. If Thorne had lied about Vaughn, what else had he covered? Her mind flashed to the courtroom, his speech, the file, the authority in his voice. He'd silenced everyone, even her. Had it all been theater? A chill moved through her as she reached her car. Inside, a folded note sat on her dashboard. No envelope, no name, just the same thin paper as before. You're not the only one watching. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove to an old diner near the Navy Yard, the kind that never closed, where secrets could hide in plain sight. The waitress brought her coffee. The air smelled of grease and rain. A man slid into the booth across from her. Mid-30s, crew-cut, plain jacket, former SEAL. She recognized the eyes before the face. "Reese," she said quietly. He nodded once. "You still drink it black. You still show up uninvited." He smiled faintly. "Got your message." She studied him. "You still have contacts inside Intel." "Depends on who's asking." "Someone who was almost destroyed by them." Reese leaned forward. "You're chasing ghosts, Sarah." She slid the flash drive across the table. "Then help me see them." He hesitated. "You really want to open that door?" "I already did." He pocketed the drive, scanning the room. "You know Thorne's untouchable, right? The man's a legend, keeps people loyal." Loyalty and fear looked the same from a distance. Reese sighed. "I'll dig, but you didn't get this from me." "Understood." As he left, Sarah caught her reflection in the diner window, tired eyes, steady hands, a face that had seen too much and trusted too little. She used to look like a soldier. Now she looked like someone learning to be human again. That night sleep found her in bursts. Dreams bled into memory, Mosul again, the girl, the smoke, the sound of her own heartbeat in the rifle's scope. But this time when she turned, the admiral was there, watching. She woke up drenched in sweat. Her phone buzzed, a message from Reese. "Meet me, Dock 14, 400, come alone." The docks were quiet when she arrived, the fog thick enough to swallow the world. Reese stood beside a black SUV, face pale under the sodium lights. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "You called me." He looked around nervously. "Something's off. The files you gave me, some of them don't exist, like they were created to be found." "What do you mean?" "I mean someone wanted you to look." She frowned. "Thorne." He shook his head, bigger. Before she could respond, a low hum filled the air, a drone, not military issue, private, watching. Reese swore under his breath. "They know we're here." He tossed her a small drive. "I copied what I could, but whatever Aegis is, it's not a task force. It's a cover." "For what?" He looked at her, eyes hard. "Black Ops, off the books. Vaughn wasn't punished, he was promoted." The drone's red light flickered overhead. Sarah grabbed Reese's arm. "We have to go." They ran, boots slapping against wet concrete, just as the SUV exploded behind them. The blast threw her forward, smoke and heat tearing through the fog. Her ears rang. She blinked through haze. Reese was down, motionless. "Reese," she crawled to him, shaking his shoulder. His eyes fluttered, blood trickling down his temple. "Run," he whispered. "They'll." Another sound cut through, the sharp crack of a suppressed round. His body went still. Sarah froze, heart hammering, eyes scanning the mist. She couldn't see the shooter, but she didn't need to. She'd heard that sound 1,000 times. Sniper. Trained, professional, military. Her military. By dawn she was gone. Her car abandoned near the river, her phone stripped of its SIM, her ID burned. They would call her AWOL by noon. But she wasn't running, not yet. She was regrouping. She checked into a rundown motel under a false name, locked the door, and collapsed against the wall. Her hands were still shaking from the blast, from the shot, from the realization that the Navy she'd served had just killed one of its own. And maybe next they'd come for her. She pulled the small drive from her pocket, Reese's final gift, plugged it into the laptop. Inside were fragments of encrypted documents, enough to glimpse patterns, not enough to prove anything. But one stood out. A name. Operation Nightglass. And beneath it a list. She read the first line aloud. Personnel, Vaughn R. Thorne J. Kane S. Her breath caught. Her name. What the hell was this? She scrolled further. Coordinates, dates. A timestamp from 2 years ago, one that matched her mission in Mosul. The mission that had defined her. The mission Thorne had used in court to defend her. Except, according to this file, that mission hadn't been an unsanctioned act of heroism. It had been deliberate. Her trigger pull, the one that saved a school full of children, had been part of a classified operation she'd never been briefed on. She hadn't broken orders. She executed them. And someone had made sure she never knew. The air in the room felt heavy. She leaned back, eyes unfocused, the laptop's glow painting her face pale. All this time she thought she'd acted on instinct, defied protocol to save lives. But maybe she just played her part in a script written by men who saw war as theater. Thorne had called her Angel once, her call sign in Mosul. He said it with pride, but now it sounded like mockery. The world outside was waking up, sirens in the distance, the faint hum of traffic, ordinary life continuing oblivious. She closed the laptop slowly, her reflection staring back, eyes sharp again. They had taken her reputation, her honor, her silence. Now they had taken her truth. But she still had something left. Resolve. She pulled out a notepad and began to write names, dates, operations, every thread she could remember. The only way to fight a shadow war was to drag it into the light. As she wrote, the fog outside lifted, faint sunlight cutting through the clouds. Maybe she thought that's what redemption really looked like. Not medals, not courtroom salutes. Just refusing to look away when the truth turned ugly. By the time she finished, the first light of morning spilled through the curtains. She gathered her gear, handgun, drive, jacket. She didn't know who she could trust. But she knew where she was going. Back to where it all began. Back to Mosul. Because sometimes, to find the truth, you have to return to the scene of your own myth. Why did it feel like she was going home to a lie? The air over Baghdad shimmered with heat as the cargo plane touched down, tires screeching against the cracked tarmac. Sarah kept her cap low, face half hidden behind aviator glasses. Her passport said consultant, her uniform long replaced by plain clothes, jeans, a worn jacket, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. 3 years ago, she'd left this soil thinking her part of the war was over, but ghosts have a way of waiting. Now she was back not as a SEAL, not even as an officer, but as a question no one wanted asked. Operation Nightglass. The name rolled through her mind like a storm. The classified document from Reese's drive had listed Mosul as its first site. It wasn't just a mission, it was a beginning, and somehow she had been part of it without ever knowing. As the plane taxied to a stop, she gripped the small notebook she'd started days ago. Inside were scattered details, dates, code names, and one line that haunted her more than any bullet wound ever could. Mission outcomes were controlled variables. Controlled. Like chess pieces moved by unseen hands. The air outside hit her like a furnace, dry, harsh, filled with the scent of sand and old fire. The city had changed, but not enough. Some scars never fade, they just hide behind new paint and flags. A dusty Toyota waited beyond the checkpoint. The driver, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a limp, waved her over. "Lieutenant Kane," he said in accented English. Sarah froze. "You shouldn't know that name." The man smiled faintly. "Relax, Thorne sent me." Her stomach tightened. "Thorne?" He nodded. "He said you'd come back." The words hit harder than any explosion. He knew. The man opened the passenger door. "Get in, too hot to talk here." She hesitated, then got in. The truck pulled away from the airfield, weaving through the narrow outskirts of the city. "Name's Hamid," he said. "Used to work with coalition forces, interpreter, fixer, sometimes guide." Sarah studied him. "And now?" "Now I help people who shouldn't be here." He glanced at her. You are one of those people. She didn't argue. They drove for hours, the desert swallowing the city until it was just dust and horizon. The sun bled into orange, then red, then dark. Finally, Hamid slowed the truck and pointed. There. She followed his gaze, a cluster of broken buildings at the edge of nothing. The schoolhouse. The one from Mosul. Even half collapsed, she recognized it instantly. The rooftop where she'd lain prone. The courtyard where the girl had stood, trembling but alive. But now it was quiet, too quiet. They stopped at the gate, rusted and half buried in sand. Why bring me here? She asked. Hamid handed her a small phone, grainy, old. It showed the same courtyard, but with something she'd never seen before. A group of men, uniformed, posing beside bodies. In the corner, Admiral Thorne. And behind him, Vaughn. Her throat went dry. When was this taken? Same day you made your shot, Hamid said. You left before they arrived. Sarah stared at the image. The men weren't rescuing. They were collecting, cataloging. What was this? Hamid looked away. Nightglass. She felt the word hit like a physical weight. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data drive. You came for truth, but truth, it costs more than bullets. She took it, her fingers brushing the cold metal. What's on this? Footage, drones, reports. They used your mission, made it look like humanitarian rescue, but it was something else. They were testing drone-guided targeting on civilians. Sarah froze. That's impossible. Hamid met her eyes. You think you saved that girl? Her breath hitched. You did, but the others, they weren't supposed to live. They were part of the experiment. The strike data was being recorded. Your shot triggered it. She shook her head. No, Thorne told me to abort. I went against orders. Hamid's gaze was steady. You didn't. That order was scripted. They wanted you to take the shot, to see if human instinct could outperform AI targeting. Her knees weakened. They used her. Her conscience, her guilt, her heroic defiance. All of it part of a test. The weight of that realization made her stumble back. The air felt thin. That night, she sat alone in the ruins of the schoolhouse, the desert wind whispering through broken windows. Her rifle, now replaced by a pistol, lay across her lap. She remembered the child's face, the tears, the relief. Had even that been orchestrated? She took out the drive and stared at it. The truth sat inside something smaller than her thumb, but heavy enough to crush everything she believed in. For years, she'd carried guilt for breaking orders. Now she was haunted by something worse, that she hadn't broken them at all. Her earpiece crackled, an old field habit, except she wasn't wearing one. Then she realized the sound wasn't in her head. It came from Hamid's radio in the truck. She ran. Hamid. Static, then a voice, English calm. Lieutenant Kane, you shouldn't have come back. Her blood ran cold. Thorne. She grabbed the receiver. You lied to me. I protected you, he said. You were never meant to see this. So you used me. I used your instinct, your morality, because that's what made the data valuable. Her hand clenched around the radio. You turned war into a lab. He sighed. War is a lab, Sarah, always has been. You just didn't like the hypothesis. The line went dead. She dropped the radio and turned. Headlights appeared over the ridge. A convoy. Not local, military grade. Hamid stumbled from the truck, eyes wide. They found us. Sarah grabbed the data drive. We have to move. They ran into the darkness, sand kicking under their boots. The trucks drew closer, beams sweeping across the ruins. Shouts in English cut through the air. Lieutenant Kane, stand down. This area is restricted. She ducked behind a wall, breathing hard. Her hand brushed her pistol, but she knew better. Against drones and rifles, one gun was useless. She looked at Hamid. You said this drive has footage. Yes. Then we make sure it lives longer than we do. She pulled her phone, hot-wired through a private satellite uplink. If I can send this. A bullet tore into the wall beside her. Dust exploded. Go, she yelled. Hamid ran toward the ravine, clutching the drive. She covered him, firing twice to slow the advancing silhouettes. Then a sound, a low whine drone. The sky lit up. The explosion threw her backward. When she opened her eyes, the world was red and ringing. Smoke choked the air. The truck was gone. Hamid was gone. Only fire remained. She crawled forward, coughing, eyes stinging, until she saw something half buried in the sand. The drive. She reached for it, fingers trembling, when another voice broke through the haze. Don't. She froze. A man stepped through the smoke, uniform dusty but pristine where it mattered. Vaughn. Alive. He smirked, lowering his sidearm. You never learn, Kane. Her heart pounded, rage slicing through the pain. You should be in a cell. He shrugged. Cells are for soldiers who lose. I'm research now. He gestured toward the burning wreckage. You really thought Thorne didn't know. He sent me to clean up your mess. Sarah rose slowly, blood trickling down her temple. And Hamid. Vaughn's eyes were cold, collateral. For a second, neither moved. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the echo of old ghosts. Then Sarah spoke, quietly, deadly. You're still afraid of me. He laughed. Of you, you're obsolete. Maybe, her hand twitched, but I'm still a better shot. His smile faded. The pistol in her hand fired once. The echo hung in the air, stretching into silence. Vaughn dropped, eyes wide with disbelief, sand swallowing him whole. Sarah's breath trembled as she lowered the weapon. No satisfaction, no triumph, just necessity. She picked up the drive and staggered toward the ridge. The sky was glowing faintly now, dawn fighting through the smoke. Hours later, she reached the outskirts of Erbil. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised, but she was alive. She found a small internet cafe and paid the attendant to use a backroom terminal. Plugged in the drive. Files opened, reports, images, video. One folder marked test footage, Mosul. She clicked. The screen filled with drone footage. The school, the convoy, her rifle's infrared signature. Then, the moment she took the shot. Coordinates lit up on the overlay. Target neutralized. Secondary detonation confirmed. It wasn't a school. It was a data site. They hadn't been protecting civilians. They'd been protecting an experiment. She closed her eyes. For years, she'd lived with the guilt of disobedience. Now she faced something worse, complicity. But she wasn't going to let it stay buried. She uploaded the files to 3 locations, encrypted, timed releases. One to the press, one to Congress, one to an anonymous online whistleblower chain. Then she leaned back, exhausted. She just declared war on her own institution. Outside, the call to prayer echoed through the city, haunting, pure, almost forgiving. Sarah stood, whispered under her breath, "Forgive me for what I thought was honor," and walked out into the rising light. How much truth can a country take before it starts to eat itself? The first story broke at dawn. A nameless blog, 3 short clips. Drone footage from Mosul, tagged Operation Nightglass. By noon, every major outlet had it. By dusk, Washington was burning with questions. Sarah watched it all unfold from a safe house outside Erbil, a 1-room concrete cube that smelled of dust and cheap cigarettes. On an old television, anchors argued over headlines they didn't understand. Words like experimental targeting, civilian casualties, covert ethics. They didn't say her name, not yet, but they would. The footage was too clear, too deliberate. The networks looped it over and over: the schoolhouse, the explosion, the heat signature of a single sniper on a rooftop. Sir. She shut off the screen. The silence pressed in. Across the ocean, Admiral Thorne sat before a wall of microphones. The Pentagon press room buzzed like an angry hive. Admiral, are these leaks authentic? Was a live operation used for weapons testing? He adjusted his collar, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The material you've seen was taken out of context, he said. What you call testing was an effort to minimize civilian harm. A lie wrapped in perfect diction. A reporter shouted, "Sir, was Lieutenant Sarah Kane involved?" Thorne's jaw flexed once. Lieutenant Kane is no longer active duty. Her record speaks for itself. He walked off the stage before anyone could ask what that meant. Back in Iraq, Sarah sat by the window, the night wind tugging at the torn curtain. She hadn't slept since she pressed upload. Part of her had expected to feel relief, vindication, justice. Instead, she felt nothing. The world she'd bled for was now tearing itself apart with her truth. Her phone buzzed, a local SIM new number. A message blinked on the screen. "You've been identified, get out now." She looked up. Through the cracked window, headlights turned down the narrow street. Not local police, not press. American SUVs. She moved fast. Backpack, drive, sidearm. The window was too high, but the roof next door was close enough. She climbed, landing hard, knees biting against gravel. From below, voices barked orders, disciplined, efficient. Special warfare, her own kind. "Secure the perimeter, she's armed." She ducked behind a water tank, breath shallow. The sound of boots filled the stairwell. They were good, too good. She whispered to herself, a habit from the old days. Stay calm, stay small, stay unseen. When the first agent stepped onto the roof, she moved like memory. One strike, silent. He dropped before he could shout. His radio crackled, sector clear. Not for long. She slipped across to the next building, down a ladder, through an alley where stray dogs scattered. She didn't stop until she reached the old train yard 2 miles out, rusted locomotives half buried in sand. There, finally, she let herself breathe. They'd come for her, not to question, to erase. Which meant Thorne knew exactly what she'd done. Thousands of miles away, his office was silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the faint tick of a clock. On his desk, 2 files. One stamped NIGHTGLASS, TERMINATED. The other KANE, Sarah, threat assessment. He opened the second. Inside were surveillance photos, movement logs, even her false passport. "Sir," a voice said from the doorway, "Commander Evers, his aide. Teams Alpha and Delta have visual." She slipped the cordon. Thorne didn't look up. "Pull them back." Evers blinked. "Sir." "Pull them back." "But..." Thorne's gaze cut through him. "She's not the target." Evers hesitated. "Then who is?" Thorne looked at the burning headlines on his monitor, the leaks, the congressional outrage, the faces of men he'd worked for decades. "The ones who ordered night glass," he said quietly. Sarah rode east through the desert in a stolen truck, the horizon turning from black to gray. Sleep clawed at her eyes, but adrenaline kept her awake. Every mile between her and the city was borrowed time. She remembered the way Thorne's voice had sounded on that radio in Mosul. Calm, reasonable, almost paternal. "You were never meant to see this." Now she saw everything. The children who died in her crossfire, the medals pinned on false heroism, the men who turned duty into data. The Navy had raised her to follow orders. The truth had taught her what they cost. Her phone buzzed again, another unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Lieutenant Kane." The voice was rough, familiar. "Thorne, you've made this bigger than you understand." "Then explain it." A pause. "They'll come for both of us now." "Why you?" I didn't leak it. But you knew. His silence said enough. Finally, meet me, Istanbul, one day. Why should I trust you? Because you're still alive, and that wasn't my order. The line went dead. By the time she crossed into Turkey, her name was everywhere. Rogue SEAL sniper leaks Pentagon secrets. Some called her a whistleblower, others a traitor. None called her a human being. At a roadside cafe, she watched the coverage on a muted TV. Her photo, uniformed, saluting, a perfect emblem of American valor, flashed across the screen beside words like treason, espionage, hero turned fugitive. The owner, an old Kurdish man, refilled her tea without asking. You look tired, he said gently. Long flight. He smiled. Where to? She hesitated. Nowhere safe. He nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Istanbul blurred like a dream. The streets alive with noise, markets, light, a city that had survived too many empires to care about another secret war. She walked along the Bosphorus at midnight, hood up, cold wind biting her face. Every sound made her flinch. Every passerby could be a tale. Then, near a ferry terminal, she saw him. Admiral Thorne. No uniform, just a gray coat and eyes that looked older than she remembered. She approached slowly. You're hard to miss. So are you, he said. Sit. They sat on a bench, overlooking the dark water. You were right, he began. Nightless wasn't research, it was leverage, a way to sell precision warfare to private contractors. Vaughn was their contact. I tried to shut it down. By lying to me. I lied to everyone. Convenient. He didn't react. When the first footage leaked years ago, the Pentagon buried it. I thought if I kept you clean, they'd leave you alone. And now, they won't stop until that data's gone. She looked out across the water. Then we don't let them erase it. Thorne studied her. You burn the Navy to the ground. I'd burn the lie. He smiled, sad, tired. You sound like I used to. She turned to him. Help me. He shook his head. I can't, not officially, but there's a man, journalist, ex-Marine, name's Keller. He'll meet you in Berlin. Give him the drive. What about you? I'll buy you time. She hesitated. Why? Thorne's eyes softened. Because you remind me of my daughter. She died in Fallujah. The system buried her too. For the first time, Sarah saw something like sorrow behind his armor. Before she could speak, a black car turned onto the waterfront. Thorne's expression hardened. Go now. What about? Go, damn it. She ran. When the gunfire started, she didn't look back. Berlin was cold, gray, and indifferent. Perfect city for ghosts. Keller found her in a train station cafe. A tall man with a limp and a quiet presence that came from having seen too much. He slid into the seat across from her. You're a hard woman to find. Thorne sent you. He nodded, barely. They got him at the docks. The words hit like a blow. He's dead. Officially suicide, unofficially, he shrugged. You know how this works. She did too well. She handed him the drive. Everything on there. Nightglass, Vaughn, Thorne's orders, enough to burn a dozen careers. He tucked it into his coat. And what about you? She looked out at the trains leaving, one after another. I don't run anymore, I survive. Keller studied her for a moment. You know, once this goes live, there's no going back. There never was. He smiled faintly. You remind me of every soldier who ever thought truth could win. She met his gaze. Sometimes it just has to try. That night she walked along the river, the city lights trembling across the water. Somewhere a siren wailed. Somewhere else, a news anchor's voice carried faintly from an open window. She wondered how long before they found her again. But for the first time in years, she felt free. Not safe, not redeemed. Just honest. And maybe that was enough. She touched the scar on her wrist where the handcuffs had once cut deep. From soldier to scapegoat to witness. The line between them had blurred, then disappeared. She whispered into the wind, almost like a prayer. I fought for them once, now I fight for the truth. At that same moment across the ocean, Keller's story hit the wires. Operation Nightglass. Leaked files expose human experimentation in U.S. drone program. The article named names. It named Vaughn. It named the defense contractors. It named Thorne and honored him for trying to stop it. But it never named Sarah Kane. Just one line at the end. A single unidentified sniper exposed the truth. Her location remains unknown. She watched it from a cafe the next morning. No sound, just scrolling text. People around her sipped coffee, unaware of the woman sitting among them, the ghost behind the story. The world kept spinning, as it should. She smiled faintly, whispered to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And as the screen faded to black, she walked out into the winter sun, no uniform, no rank, no country. Just a name no one could erase. How long can you live in silence before it starts sounding like peace? 3 months after Berlin, Sarah lived in the mountains of northern Spain, in a village too small for a name on most maps. The kind of place where time moved slower, and the past had to chase you uphill to reach you. The world still talked about Nightglass. Congress held hearings, officials resigned, contracts were canceled. But the noise never reached this high. Up here, there were only bells from the goats, the smell of pine, and a woman trying to remember who she'd been before medals and missions. She rented a cabin from an old couple who didn't ask questions. To them, she was Elena, an American photographer studying light. Light, if only that were true. Each morning she hiked into the valley, camera slung around her shoulder, empty, without film, pretending to capture the beauty of quiet things. But every shutter click was just a heartbeat, reminding her she was still alive. Some nights she dreamed of Mosul again, not the gunfire, not the mission, but the silence afterward. The girl's face, the feeling of sand under her palms, the confusion of doing right and being punished for it. And when she woke, she'd whisper to herself, "You're safe," even if she didn't believe it. One afternoon, while buying bread in the village square, she heard a radio playing behind the counter. A reporter's voice, calm, clipped British accent. The Senate Intelligence Committee released its findings today, confirming the existence of Operation Nightglass, a covert weapons research program that manipulated live combat scenarios for data acquisition. Several high-ranking officials are now facing criminal indictment. Admiral James Thorne was posthumously cleared of wrongdoing. Sarah froze, loaf half wrapped in paper. Posthumously cleared. She exhaled slowly, almost smiling. So the world had finally learned what she already knew. Thorne wasn't the villain they painted him to be. The shopkeeper glanced up. "You understand English." "Just enough," Sarah said softly, and left before her voice broke. Back at the cabin, she poured coffee, set it beside the window, and opened her worn notebook. Inside were pages filled with fragments, thoughts, coordinates, lessons she wasn't ready to forget. On the last page she'd written, "Truth doesn't erase guilt, it only shares it." She traced the words with her finger. For all she'd done, the leaks, the deaths, the choices, the question still haunted her. Was the truth worth what it cost? The world might never know her name, but people were alive because of what she'd exposed. Children, soldiers, maybe even nations. Yet some nights, she still heard the echo of Vaughn's last words, "You're obsolete." Maybe he was right. Maybe the world no longer needed people like her. But conscience was never obsolete. Snow came early that year. By December, the village was wrapped in white silence. Sarah split wood behind the cabin, each swing measured, deliberate. Her muscles ached pleasantly, the kind of pain that reminded her she was human, not a weapon. She'd almost grown used to it, anonymity. Until the letter came. A plain envelope, no return address. Spanish postage. Inside, one line typed on clean paper. They found Keller. Her heart skipped. Keller, the journalist who'd risked everything to publish Night Glass. She grabbed her pack, her pistol, her passport. Running wasn't panic anymore, it was reflex. Madrid's train station was chaos and neon. She moved through crowds like a ghost, head down, pace steady, nothing hurried. At a cafe near the platform, a man sat waiting. Civilian clothes, gray hair, a scar down his jaw, not Keller. When she sat, he slid a folder across the table. Inside, a photo. Keller dead. A second photo, a burned laptop. Then a third, a surveillance still. "Sorry. Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Ramos," he said. "Interpol. Keller contacted us before he died, said if anything happened to him, we should find you." "Why?" "He claimed you had the last copy of the original files." She frowned. He was supposed to delete them. Ramos shook his head. "Someone didn't. Now everyone wants it, intelligence agencies, contractors, even your own government. That drive could destroy half the defense sector." Sarah leaned back, heartbeat steady. "Maybe that's the point." Ramos studied her. "They call you a hero, others call you a traitor. What do you call yourself?" She hesitated, tired. He smiled sadly. "There's talk of a protection deal, amnesty, if you hand over the data." "And if I do?" "Then they'll come, and they won't stop this time." He slid her a business card and left, disappearing into the station crowd. Sarah looked down at the card. No address, no title. Just a number. She tore it in half. That night she sat on a bench overlooking the city lights, the folder still in her hands. Keller's eyes stared up at her from the photo, steady, unafraid. He'd died for the truth she unleashed. She whispered, "I'm sorry," and the wind carried it away. Her phone buzzed once, unknown number. A voice low and urgent, "Elena." She froze. No one here called her that over the phone. "Who is this?" "Hamid's cousin. He left something for you." Her pulse jumped. "Hamid's dead." "I know, but what he carried is." Static, then an address in Istanbul. Before she could reply, the line cut. 2 days later, she crossed the border again. No plan, no backup, just a direction. The cafe in Istanbul was the same one where she'd last seen Thorne. The waterfront smelled of diesel and rain. Inside, a young man sat alone, nervously stirring tea. When she approached, he stood. "Your cane." She didn't deny it. He handed her a small package. "He told me to give you this if you ever came back." She unwrapped it carefully. A flash drive, different from the others. On its side engraved letters, "For when the noise stops." Thorne's words. She plugged it into her laptop right there in the cafe. A video opened, grainy footage of Thorne himself, recorded weeks before his death. If you're watching this, they've already won the narrative. Night Glass wasn't about weapons. It was about control, of truth, of fear, of what soldiers believe they're fighting for. I made choices I can't defend, but I never stopped believing in what you represent. Don't let them bury conscience under data. Don't let them call obedience courage. The video ended. Sarah sat frozen, hands trembling slightly. Outside, the rain started, soft, persistent, cleansing. Later that night, she uploaded the video anonymously. No names, no context, just truth. Within hours, it spread. People called it the Admiral's Confession. It reignited everything: hearings, debates, protests. But Sarah didn't stay to watch. She walked to the docks as dawn rose over the water. The sky glowed pale gold. Fishermen shouted in Turkish. Life went on. She dropped the flash drive into the sea. Some truths weren't meant to be kept. Weeks passed. She drifted across Europe under new names, border to border, language to language, until she ended up in the mountains again, this time in Switzerland. She rented a small room above a bookstore, spent days reading, writing, watching snow fall. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection in the shop window, clean clothes, quiet eyes, no insignia. She looked ordinary, and maybe that was the greatest freedom of all. One evening, the shopkeeper's daughter, a girl about 8, with wide, curious eyes, approached her as she sat by the fire. "Miss Elena, is it true you were a soldier?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Who told you that?" "Papa said you look like someone who remembers too much." Sarah laughed softly. "He's not wrong." The girl hesitated. Was it scary? Sarah thought for a long moment before answering. Sometimes, but sometimes it was brave. The girl frowned. "Can something be both?" Sarah nodded. "The bravest things usually are." That night, Sarah wrote in her notebook again. The fire crackled. The mountains outside were silent under the snow. She wrote, "Peace isn't the absence of war. It's learning to breathe in its memory." She closed the book, set it aside, and watched the embers fade to red. Somewhere below, the village bells rang midnight. She didn't pray, she didn't need to. For the first time, she felt something close to forgiveness, not from the world but from herself. In Washington, the final hearings concluded quietly. Night glass was officially dismantled. New laws were proposed, none perfect. History had already begun to rewrite itself. But buried deep in an intelligence archive, a sealed folder remained. K.A.N.E. Sarah unresolved. Someone had underlined one line in red ink. Status presumed deceased. High in the Alps, a woman walked a narrow path above a frozen lake, camera in hand. She paused, took a picture of the sunrise, and smiled. Not because she'd won. Not because she'd escaped. But because she'd finally stopped running. The wind carried her whisper across the snow. Some stories aren't meant to end, just to rest. What happens when the past you buried comes knocking, not to haunt you, but to ask for guidance? Snow still clung to the rooftops of the little Swiss town when Sarah heard the knock on her door. 3 short taps, not hesitant, not forceful, measured. Soldier's rhythm. She froze mid-motion, coffee half poured, heart suddenly drumming a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. No one came up here, not without purpose. She set the mug down, moved to the window, glanced through the frost. A young man stood outside the bookstore entrance below, coat dusted with snow, posture crisp, eyes scanning the street in quiet vigilance. Not a threat, not a local. Something in his stillness reminded her of herself long ago. She opened the door slowly. He looked up. "Miss Elena." Her alias. He knew it, but the way he said it told her he knew more. "I need to talk to you," he said. His accent was American, East Coast maybe, polished by discipline. Sarah studied him. "You traveled a long way for a stranger." He met her eyes. "For a teacher." Inside, the small stove hissed while snow melted off his boots. He introduced himself. Captain David Hale, U.S. Army Intelligence Liaison. Mid-30s, calm voice, an edge of exhaustion behind it. "I know who you are," he said quietly, "or who you used to be." Sarah didn't answer. She learned long ago that silence was its own interrogation. He placed a folder on the table. "We found your files, the unredacted ones, not the leaks, the originals. Nightglass, Mosul, everything." Her stomach turned cold. Those were supposed to be erased. They weren't. Someone in the archives kept a copy. Accident maybe, or maybe someone wanted them found. She exhaled slowly. "So why come here?" He looked at her for a long time before saying, "Because I don't know what to do with them." He told her about the new task force, Project Aegis II, a so-called ethical warfare initiative. Same rhetoric, same funding. They're building smarter systems, he said. AI that predicts conflict before it starts. They're using night glass data to train it. They call it preventive peacekeeping. Sarah gave a bitter laugh. They've just found a new word for control. Maybe, but they claim it'll save lives. So did we. Hale looked down. That's why I came. The brass says we're building safety. My gut says we're repeating history. I wanted to hear it from the only person who's lived it. Sarah walked to the window. Outside, snow fell in soft spirals. When you pull a trigger, she said, you tell yourself you're ending violence, but violence doesn't end. It just changes its name. He nodded slowly. You regret leaking it. She turned back, eyes sharp. I regret not understanding it sooner. They talked for hours, about missions, about orders, about the quiet ways conscience corrodes when you're trained to obey. For Hale it was theoretical, for Sarah it was scars. Finally, he asked, if you could go back, would you still expose it? She thought for a long moment, the clock ticking between them. Yes, she said, but I'd tell the truth differently, not as revenge, as warning. He nodded, then help me warn them. She frowned, why me? Because they'll listen to you. You're the ghost they still whisper about in training. Sarah almost laughed. The Navy teaches recruits about the woman who broke the Navy. They teach the story, Hale said, not the truth. In theirs, you're a cautionary tale about emotion clouding duty. But that's why I searched for you, because every generation inherits the last generation's silence. Something softened in her expression, not quite pride, not yet forgiveness. You believe people change, Captain. I believe they try. For the next week, Hale stayed in the spare room above the shop. Together, they reviewed the recovered files line by line, not to publish, but to understand. The data had evolved. Algorithms cross-referencing battlefield patterns, soldier stress responses, even biometric empathy markers. Look at this, he said one night, pointing to a chart. They've learned to predict when a sniper will disobey an immoral order, and they're using that to automate decisions. Sarah's stomach turned. So the system punishes conscience before it happens. He nodded, exactly. She leaned back, eyes hollow. They built a machine to erase hesitation. They finally found a way to kill guilt. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Hale said quietly, maybe that's why they need you. Someone who remembers what hesitation costs and what it saves. Word of his disappearance from the base reached Washington a week later. The hunt began again, not for her this time, but for him. He knew it, she knew it. One morning he came downstairs with his duffel packed. They'll track me through comms soon. I can't stay. Sarah poured coffee, handed him a cup. So what's your plan? Take this data to people who still care. Independent tribunal, maybe Geneva. She smirked. You really think justice comes with a badge and a banner? He smiled. No, but maybe it starts with courage. You taught me that. The words landed heavier than he knew. She looked at him for a long time, then handed him a small object, a coin, tarnished from years in her pocket. The same sealed challenge coin Hamid had left for her on that pier years ago. What's this? Proof that conscience survives the chain of command. He pocketed it carefully. You coming with me? She shook her head. Someone has to stay quiet so the noise can travel. He hesitated, then saluted. The gesture was awkward, sincere. Sarah returned it, slow, deliberate. For a moment, it felt like closure. After he left, the cabin felt emptier than ever. Days passed, the snow melted, the air smelled of thawing earth. She tried to read, to write, to disappear back into anonymity, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. Each night she'd stand by the window, watching the road below, half expecting headlights. None came. Until one evening they did. Two black cars, sleek, unmarked. Her heart clenched. She reached for her pack, the last backup drive, the notebook, her sidearm. By the time the knock came, she was ready. The door creaked open to reveal a woman, mid-40s, military posture, soft eyes. "Lieutenant Kane." Sarah said nothing. The woman held up her credentials. Major Ellen Parker, Internal Affairs. Sarah smiled thinly. "You took your time." "We weren't looking for you," Parker said. "We were looking for Captain Hale. He's missing." Sarah's blood ran cold. Missing. Parker nodded. His convoy vanished outside Geneva. No signal, no wreckage, but your name was in his log. Sarah's grip on the notebook tightened. "Then he's dead." "We don't know that." She studied the major. "You will." That night Sarah sat awake by the dying fire, Parker's words echoing. If Hale was gone, it meant someone inside the system still feared what he carried. Nightglass wasn't dead. It had evolved again. She opened her notebook and turned to the last page, wrote 4 words. "Truth is never finished." She tore out the page, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. The next morning she mailed it to Parker. No note, no return address. Inside the envelope, along with the page, she placed a small USB, a duplicate of everything Hale had taken. Insurance. Legacy. She didn't wait to see what came of it. A month later, Parker stood before a classified committee, presenting evidence of a renewed AI warfare program operating under private funding. Her testimony sparked another investigation, quieter this time, but real. And on her desk, she kept that torn page from the envelope. Truth is never finished. She didn't know who wrote it. She didn't have to. Back in Switzerland, spring arrived. The snow melted into streams that sang through the valley. Sarah sat on a bench outside the bookstore, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The shopkeeper's daughter ran up, holding a newspaper. "Miss Elena, they say a soldier made the generals tell the truth again. Is that real?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Sometimes it is." The girl frowned. Was she scared? Every day. Then why'd she do it? Sarah looked out across the valley, sunlight catching the last patches of snow. Because fear means you still care. The girl tilted her head. "Are you afraid?" Sarah thought about the men she'd fought, the lies she'd exposed, the ghosts she'd carried. She thought about Hale, about Thorn, about the cost of silence and the price of truth. Then she smiled, small, calm, real. Not anymore. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah packed a small bag. Camera, passport, notebook, nothing more. The world didn't need her to fight again, but maybe it needed her to witness. She locked the cabin, left the key under the stone step, and started down the path. The air smelled of pine and promise. She whispered to herself, maybe peace isn't found. Maybe it's built, one honest act at a time. And she walked on, the light fading, footsteps blending into the wind. What do you become when the fight is finally over, but the purpose that kept you alive is gone? Sarah followed the mountain road until it curved into the valley below, the world opening before her like a long-delayed breath. Morning light spilled across fields of green and stone, the air clean enough to sting. For the first time in years, she didn't check her 6. She just walked. Her body still moved like a soldier's, measured, alert, but inside, something had loosened. Each step was a small surrender to life. She reached a village by the lake before noon. Fishermen called to one another in a language she barely understood. A boy chased a dog along the pier, laughing so hard he stumbled into his father's arms. That sound, laughter without fear, startled her more than gunfire ever had. She rented a small room above the harbor cafe. The owner, a widow named Marta, gave her a key and a smile that didn't pry. "Long stay." "Until it feels like one," Sarah said. Days turned into a rhythm. Mornings at the pier, evenings sketching in a notebook that used to hold coordinates and kill counts. She drew faces now, strangers, clouds, the outlines of things that didn't shoot back. At night she'd sit on the balcony, watching lanterns drift across the lake, each one carrying someone's wish. She wondered what hers would be. Peace, forgiveness, or just enough time to understand the difference. One afternoon a letter arrived, Swiss postmark, typed official, but the handwriting on the envelope stopped her breath. Inside was a single page on ministry letterhead. From Major Ellen Parker. Subject Captain David Hale. Recovered alive. Geneva investigation ongoing. Your materials initiated formal oversight on predictive AI programs. History may never know your name, but policy will remember it. At the bottom, handwritten in pen. Truth is never finished, but sometimes it rests. Sarah folded the letter carefully, set it beside her coffee, and looked out at the water. For once, she let herself smile without the weight of survival behind it. Weeks later, Marta asked her for a favor. The local school needed someone to teach English 2 mornings a week. Nothing formal, just conversation. Sarah hesitated. I'm not good with classrooms. You're good with quiet people, Marta said. That's rarer. So she tried. The first lesson felt strange, standing in front of children who had never heard gunfire, explaining simple words. Hope, storm, home. A small boy raised his hand. Miss Elena, what's honor mean? Sarah paused, marker hovering above the board. She could have said what the manual said, doing what's right when no one's watching. But she'd lived long enough to know it was harder than that. Honor, she said softly, is telling the truth even when it costs you something. The boy nodded, satisfied. The rest just kept writing. But for Sarah, the word lingered in the air like smoke that finally found a way to fade. By spring, tourists began arriving, hikers, photographers, couples. One day a woman approached her at the cafe terrace, American accent, curious eyes, a small recorder half hidden in her bag. Excuse me, she said. You wouldn't happen to be Elena Markson, would you? I'm doing a piece on post-conflict veterans living abroad. Sarah felt her heart beat slow, old instinct, the pause before deciding whether to run. Then she simply shook her head. No, sorry, wrong person. The reporter smiled politely and moved on. Sarah exhaled, relief and something else. Sadness, maybe, because even if the world never recognized her, it was finally safe enough to ask. That night she opened her notebook again. On the last blank page she wrote. They called it night glass, but glass only reflects what you point it toward. Maybe war shows us the worst of ourselves so we can choose better the next time. She tore the page out, tucked it between the cafe's books for someone else to find someday. Legacy didn't need signatures, just sincerity. Summer warmed the valley, the school closed for holidays. Sarah spent her days helping Marta fix boats, paint shutters, repair the small pier. Simple work, work that stayed fixed when you finished it. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, she sat by the water with Marta's daughter, the same girl who once asked if bravery could be scary. The child pointed at the horizon. Look, Miss Elena, the sky looks like fire. Sarah smiled. That's what light does when it's about to rest. Does it come back? Always. The girl leaned her head on Sarah's shoulder. Then you'll stay too. Sarah hesitated just long enough to mean it, for a while. That night the wind shifted, warmer, full of summer scents. She lay awake listening to the lake lap against the dock. So many sounds had once meant danger. Now they just meant life continuing. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream without gunfire. In the dream, she was back on that Mosul rooftop, but there were no targets this time. Only children playing below, laughter carrying up through the smoke. She lowered the rifle and watched them run, free and untouched. When she woke, she was crying quietly, Not from pain, from release. Months passed. Letters came now and then from Parker, updates about tribunals, policy reforms, even quiet acknowledgments in classified memos. The world was moving on, inch by inch, learning, forgetting, learning again. Sarah didn't need to answer. Her silence had always spoken louder. The villagers knew her as Elena, the quiet teacher with the faraway stare and the steady hands. They didn't know about the courtroom, the admiral, the handcuffs. They didn't need to. Because peace, she'd learned, wasn't the reward for telling the truth. It was the space left when you finally stopped running from it. One autumn morning, Marta found a letter on the counter, Sarah's careful handwriting on the envelope. Inside, 2 items: a folded note and a small camera memory card. The note read, "For the children's project, every photo is theirs, not mine. Teach them to see beauty before they ever learn to aim." Marta looked out toward the pier, but the room upstairs was already empty. Sarah walked along the mountain road again, pack light, hair tucked under a cap. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and rain. No destination this time, just forward. Every step whispered the same rhythm as the first day she'd been cuffed in that courtroom. Restraint, release, resolve. She passed a bus stop where an old newspaper fluttered against the wall. The headline, in bold European print: Global Coalition adopts Kane Accord, new ethics code for autonomous warfare. She stopped, read it twice. The world had borrowed her name after all, not to glorify but to remind. She smiled, small and tired, then kept walking. As evening fell, she reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun bled into the horizon, golden and fierce. She sat on a stone, pulled out her notebook, a new one this time, pages mostly blank. She wrote, "War made me a weapon, truth made me dangerous, silence made me free." She paused, added one last line beneath it. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." She closed the notebook, set it beside her, and watched the light fade until the sky turned violet. When darkness came, she didn't rise. She just listened to the wind through the grass, to the distant chime of village bells, to the heartbeat she no longer needed to hide. And somewhere in that stillness, the soldier became something else entirely. Not a fugitive, not a legend, just a witness, living proof that truth, however scarred, can survive its own war.